Sprawling city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the glass towers that surrounded him. It had been a long day of meetings and negotiations, but the weight of his success never seemed to lighten. A multi-billion-dollar business empire, a sprawling mansion, luxury cars, and anything money could buy had it all. But none of these things filled the void that had lingered inside him ever since his wife, Elizabeth, passed away. It had been 8 years since her death, and though he had thrown himself into work to cope, he couldn't help but feel the deep absence of the woman he had loved. Elizabeth had been everything to him as Rock, his confidant, and the one person who had truly understood him. But now it was just him and Noah, their son. Noah was Alexander's pride and joy. At 10 years old, he was already sharp, kind-hearted, and full of life. Noah had inherited Elizabeth's gentle nature, her warm smile, and her ability to light up a room. Alexander had poured all of his energy into being the best father he could be, but the weight of raising his son without Elizabeth was a burden he couldn't fully carry. In their massive mansion, Noah had everything a child could dream of: expensive toys, a private school education, trips around the world, and every material thing that could possibly make him happy. Yet, Alexander was deeply aware that no amount of money could replace the love and care that a mother could provide. He had tried to fill that gap by hiring a maid, someone who could look after Noah, help with his studies, and take care of the household when he was away. Her name was Maria Young, hardworking and diligent. Alexander had chosen her based on the recommendation of a close friend, and he trusted her with his son's safety and well-being. Maria was pleasant enough, with a calm and quiet demeanor. She had always been polite and respectful, never overstepping her boundaries. Alexander had no reason to doubt her until that fateful day when everything changed. It was an ordinary afternoon, or so it seemed, when Alexander received an anonymous email that would shatter his perception of his family's safety. He had been working late, as usual, when he noticed the subject line of the email: "A father's worst nightmare." Without thinking, he opened the email. Inside was a video with no explanation. A chill ran down his spine as he clicked on it, his eyes widening as the image loaded. At first, it was unclear what he was seeing. It was a recording from a hidden camera of the cameras he had installed in various rooms of the house to monitor the security of his family. The video showed his son Noah sitting alone in the playroom. Maria was there too, but her actions were not what he had expected. The video began to play out in real time. Maria was supposed to be taking care of Noah, helping him with his homework or keeping him company. Instead, she was seen whispering in Noah's ear, coaxing him into something that made Alexander's heart race with fear and confusion. She seemed to be playing a role, but it was clear that something was off. The next part of the video was a complete shock. Maria, in a soft and convincing voice, had Noah perform tasks that were far beyond any reasonable request for a 10-year-old. She had encouraged him to act out strange scenarios, asking him to repeat unsettling phrases, and even giving him peculiar instructions that were difficult to understand. Noah, like a child trying to please an adult, complied, his expression a mixture of confusion and unease. The deeper Alexander watched, the more disturbed he became. This wasn't just a case of childish imagination or playful antics. This was something far darker. It was as though Maria was manipulating Noah in ways that a trusted guardian should never do. The video continued, showing Maria's subtle yet unsettling influence on Noah's behavior. She had promised him rewards, praise, and affection whenever he followed her instructions, creating a dangerous and unhealthy dynamic between the two. Alexander's blood ran cold as he witnessed his son, his sweet, innocent boy, being drawn into this twisted scenario. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had trusted Maria with his son. She had been his caretaker, the one person who was supposed to be a safe and reliable presence in their home. But now Alexander could see that she had been quietly undermining that trust all along. The video was evidence of something far more sinister than just inappropriate behavior. It was clear that Maria had been grooming Noah, manipulating him into situations that he didn't understand and that he should never have been exposed to. Alexander sat in his office, staring at the screen, his hands trembling as the video continued to play. He felt his stomach turn, the tightness in his chest growing with every second. This wasn't just a betrayal of his trust, it was a violation of everything he held dear. His son, the one thing that mattered most in his life, was being hurt in ways he had never imagined. Alexander's mind raced. He needed to confront Maria, to find out the truth. But how could he approach the situation without causing further harm to Noah? How could he navigate the delicate balance between protecting his son and preserving the family's dignity? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Noah entered the room, his small frame barely visible over the top of the desk. Alexander turned to him, his heart breaking at the sight of his son, who still seemed so innocent and unaware of the dark reality that had been unfolding around him. "Dad, is everything okay?" Noah asked, his voice full of concern. "You've been looking at the screen for a long time." Alexander's throat tightened as he tried to find the words. He couldn't let his son see the fear that had taken hold of him. He couldn't let him know the terrible truth that had just come to light. "I'm fine, Noah," Alexander said, forcing a smile. "Just some work stuff. How was your day?" Noah, still innocent and unaware of the gravity of the situation, shrugged. "It was okay. Maria helped me with my homework, but then she went out for a bit. I'm glad she's here. I think I'm starting to like her more now." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He had no idea how to respond. His sweet boy had been manipulated into thinking that Maria was someone he could trust, someone who cared for him. As Noah sat down beside him, Alexander's heart ached. He had to protect him. He had to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. "Listen, Noah," Alexander began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need you to be very careful about who you trust, okay? You're a smart boy, but sometimes people don't always have your best interests at heart." Noah nodded, his innocent eyes wide as he processed his father's words. "I know, Dad. You always tell me that." But Alexander knew that words weren't enough. He needed to take action. He needed to confront Maria and get to the bottom of what was truly happening in his home. As the evening wore on, Alexander's mind raced with questions. What had driven Maria to behave this way? Had she been working alone? Or was there someone else involved? And what was Noah's role in all of this? Was he aware of the manipulation? Or was he just a pawn in something much bigger than himself? The answers were elusive, but one thing was certain. Alexander would stop at nothing to protect his son. He would find the truth, no matter the cost. The night seemed endless for Alexander. Every time he tried to close his eyes, he was haunted by the image of the video his son Noah, caught in a web of manipulation that he couldn't fully comprehend. His mind raced, replaying the moments captured in that haunting footage. Maria's calm voice, the strange instructions, the way she seemed to subtly control Noah, everything about it felt wrong. The video had shown him enough, but it didn't explain why. Why had Maria, someone he had trusted, done this? What was her motivation? As he sat at his desk, staring out the window into the darkened city below, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't wait. He couldn't allow the uncertainty to fester any longer. He had to act now. The next morning, after a restless night, Alexander made up his mind. He would confront Maria. He would not allow her to manipulate or control his son any longer. But he had to be careful. Noah had become attached to her, and it wouldn't be easy for him to understand why she had to leave. He needed to find the right balance between protecting Noah and not destroying the trust he had in his father. With a heavy heart, Alexander called his private investigator, a man named Thomas who had been working with him for years. Thomas had always been reliable and discreet, and Alexander knew that he could trust him to find out the truth about Maria's past. "I need you to dig into Maria," Alexander said when the call connected. "I need to know everything about her, where she's from, who she associates with, and if there's any history I should be worried about." "Understood," Thomas replied. I'll get back to you as soon as I have anything." While waiting for the investigator's report, Alexander decided to speak with Noah. He knew this conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. He needed to explain why Maria had to leave, without traumatizing his son in the process. That afternoon, as Noah returned home from school, Alexander sat down with him in the living room. His son's innocent smile tugged at his heartstrings. It was a reminder of everything he was trying to protect, everything that mattered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves before speaking. "Noah," he began softly, "I need to talk to you about something serious. Something about Maria." Noah's brow furrowed in confusion. "What about Maria, Dad? I don't want her to leave. She helps me with homework and she's nice to me." "I know she's been helpful," Alexander said, his voice calm but firm. "But there are some things that you don't understand yet, and it's my job to protect you." Noah looked up at his father, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What's wrong, Dad? Did I do something bad?" No, of course not," Alexander quickly reassured him. "It's not your fault. You've been a good boy, Noah. But Maria, she's been acting in a way that isn't okay, and I have to make sure you're safe. You understand?" Noah's face showed confusion, and Alexander could see the hurt in his son's eyes. He knew that Noah had grown attached to Maria, and the thought of losing her, especially when he didn't fully understand the situation, would be painful. "I don't get it, Dad," Noah said quietly. "Why is she bad? She's just been helping me." Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his heart aching at the innocence in Noah's voice. "Sometimes, people don't show us who they really are until it's too late. I'm not saying that Maria is a bad person, but I need to make sure that you're not being hurt. That's why we have to be careful about who we trust. Okay?" Noah nodded, though the confusion still lingered on his face. "Okay, Dad." As Alexander stood up to leave the room, he felt the weight of his decision. Noah had taken the news better than he expected, but the truth was still too raw. He had to protect his son, no matter the cost. A few hours later, Thomas called back with the information Alexander had requested. His voice was low and serious as he spoke. "Mr. Hartley, I've looked into Maria," Thomas began, "and I found something troubling. Maria wasn't always who she claimed to be. She has a history, a criminal one." Alexander's stomach tightened. "What kind of criminal history?" "She was arrested a few years ago," Thomas continued. "It was for child neglect and a series of disturbing incidents involving children she was supposed to be caring for. Nothing was proven in court, but there were enough complaints for her to be removed from several positions. She went by different names, trying to hide her past. It seems that she's been trying to keep her history from everyone, including you." Alexander felt his blood run cold. Maria, the woman he had trusted with Noah's care, was not who she appeared to be. The revelation was more than he could bear. How could he have missed the signs? He had done everything in his power to provide a safe, secure life for his son. And yet, he had allowed this dangerous woman into their home. "Where is she now?" Alexander demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm not sure," Thomas replied. "I'll track her down, but it may take some time. Get to it. I want to know where she is, and I want her gone." That evening, Alexander sat in his office, brooding over everything that had happened. His thoughts kept circling back to Noah. He had promised to protect him, to keep him safe. But in his quest for success, had he been so blinded by his own ambition that he had failed to see the danger lurking right under his roof? His mind drifted back to the video, the way Maria had manipulated Noah, subtly twisting his innocence. He couldn't stop the images from flashing in his mind. It was clear now that Maria had been playing a game of her own, one where Noah was nothing more than a pawn. But what had been her endgame? What had she hoped to gain? It was a question he couldn't answer, but one that he would find out. The next morning, Alexander wasted no time. With the information from Thomas, he had arranged a meeting with Maria. She had no idea that her life was about to unravel. When she arrived at the mansion, Alexander greeted her with a coldness that she hadn't seen before. She seemed unaware of the storm that was about to hit, but Alexander had no intention of letting her off easy. "Maria," he said, his voice controlled but filled with underlying rage. "I know what you've been doing, and I know what you've been hiding." Maria's face went pale, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But Alexander had already made sure there was none. The doors were locked, and there was no way out. "You have one chance to explain yourself," he continued, his voice steady, "before I go to the authorities." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had been caught and she knew it. Maria stood before Alexander, her face pale and stricken with fear. The once composed and seemingly reliable woman had now been exposed for the fraud she truly was. The truth that Alexander had uncovered about her criminal past hung heavily in the air between them. She knew the game was up. No more pretending, no more deceit. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maria stammered, her voice shaking. "What do you mean? What are you accusing me of?" Alexander's gaze remained cold, his anger barely contained. He wasn't about to let her manipulate the situation further. The evidence was undeniable. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low but filled with fury. "I know about your past, the arrests, the accusations. You've been playing me, Maria. You've been playing my son." Maria's eyes widened, her lips quivering. For a moment, it looked like she might break down, but she quickly regained her composure, though her hands trembled. "Mr. Hartley," she began, her tone desperate, "I've changed. I swear I'm not the same person anymore. You don't know what it's like to be." "Enough!" Alexander snapped, his patience running thin. "I don't care about your excuses. What matters now is what you've done to Noah. You've manipulated him. You've twisted his trust. And I can't let that slide." Maria opened her mouth as if to say something more, but the words faltered. She knew she had no defense now. The reality of her actions was sinking in. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice breaking. "I wasn't trying to hurt him. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to survive. Trying to fit in, to make a life. I thought if I could gain his trust." "Gain his trust?" Alexander interrupted, his voice rising. "You've done more than that. You've manipulated him for your own benefit. What were you going to do next? Make him an accomplice in whatever twisted game you were playing? Were you going to hurt him too?" Maria recoiled at the accusation. Her face was drained of color now, her thoughts in turmoil. She had never intended for things to escalate to this level, but her actions had indeed crossed a dangerous line. And now, she was trapped. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. I needed this. I was desperate." Desperation. That was the crux of it. Alexander knew that people acted out of desperation, but he also knew that it didn't justify betrayal. The more he heard her explain, the more his own disbelief grew. He could never have imagined the woman who had been so calm, so pleasant, had harbored such dark intentions. "You need to leave," Alexander said firmly, his voice unyielding. "And if you so much as show up near my son again, I will call the police. This is your final warning, Maria." Maria stood motionless, her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Alexander saw the faintest hint of tears in her eyes. But any sympathy he might have felt for her was quickly erased by the realization that she had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Later that night, Alexander sat alone in his study, his mind racing. It was hard to fathom how deeply he had been deceived. He had thought that Maria was someone he could trust, someone who would help raise Noah in a safe environment. But it had all been a lie. The reality of it was suffocating, and it left him with a sense of betrayal he had never felt before. He thought about Noah, who was likely still unaware of the true extent of what had transpired. His son had trusted Maria, had grown fond of her. Noah was innocent, too young to understand the dangers that lurked behind the smiles and sweet words of the woman who had been hired to care for him. The worst part, Alexander realized, was the impact this would have on Noah. His son had always been a kind and trusting child, and this betrayal would challenge everything he had been taught about safety, trust, and love. It would be a difficult lesson, one Alexander would have to help him navigate. But first, he had to deal with the immediate aftermath of what had just happened. The next morning, Noah came down for breakfast as if nothing had changed. Alexander watched him with a mix of concern and sadness. How could he explain to his son that Maria, the woman he had trusted, had manipulated him in ways that were unimaginable? "Morning, Dad," Noah said cheerfully, sitting down at the breakfast table. "I finished the book you got me yesterday. It was really good. Can I go to the park later?" Alexander forced a smile, but the weight in his chest was almost unbearable. "Morning, Noah. Sure, we can go to the park later, but there's something important we need to talk about first." Noah looked up from his cereal, sensing that something was off. "What is it, Dad? Did something happen with Maria?" Alexander took a deep breath. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew he couldn't hide the truth from Noah any longer. "Yes, Noah. Something did happen with Maria. She's not going to be working here anymore." Noah's face fell, and Alexander saw the hurt in his eyes. "Why? What did she do? I thought she was nice. She helped me with my homework and—" "She wasn't who we thought she was, Noah," Alexander interrupted gently. "She lied to me, and she lied to you. She's been manipulating you, making you do things you didn't understand, and I can't allow that to continue." Noah blinked, processing the words slowly. "Manipulating me? What do you mean?" "I don't understand." Alexander's heart ached as he searched for the right words. "I know this is hard to understand, but sometimes people pretend to be something they're not. They take advantage of others when they're vulnerable. Maria did that to you, Noah, and I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Tears welled up in Noah's eyes. He didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but he could feel the sadness and fear in his father's voice. "I didn't know. I just thought she was nice. I didn't want her to leave." Alexander pulled Noah into a hug, holding him tightly. "I know, son. I know. But I'm here for you. You're safe now, and I promise we'll get through this together. No one is going to hurt you again." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Alexander had no idea what the future held, but he knew that this was a turning point. He had protected his son from the worst, but the healing would take time. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Later that day, Thomas contacted Alexander with the news that Maria had disappeared. Her whereabouts were unknown, and there were no signs of her leaving the city. But for now, Alexander knew he had done what was necessary. Maria was out of their lives, and his son was safe. However, the damage had already been done. The emotional scars from this betrayal would take time to heal. Noah would need his father's support more than ever. But for now, Alexander held on to one certainty. He would protect his son with everything he had. The days following Maria's departure were a blur of emotional turmoil for both Alexander and Noah. The house, once filled with the sounds of Maria's presence or laughter, her guidance was now eerily quiet. Alexander spent more time at home than he ever had before, trying to provide a sense of stability for his son, who was still reeling from the shock of the revelation. Noah, despite his young age, had become unusually withdrawn. He spent hours in his room, staring out the window as if lost in thought. At night, he would sometimes cry quietly, his sobs muffled by the covers. Alexander would hear him, his heart breaking with each sound. As a father, the helplessness he felt in those moments was unbearable. He had tried to talk to Noah, but the boy was hesitant to open up. It was as though the walls Maria had built around him had left scars that would take time to heal. He wasn't just grieving the loss of Maria, but the loss of trust, something he had once thought was unshakable. Alexander had never felt more distant from his son. The bond they had shared was now marred by the deception that had unfolded in their lives. The guilt gnawed at him. How could he have let Maria into their lives so fully? How could he have missed the signs? But deep down, Alexander knew that there was no use in dwelling on what had already happened. What mattered now was moving forward, helping Noah rebuild his trust in him, and more importantly, in the world around him. One evening, as the sun began to set, Alexander sat down with Noah in the living room. It was time to have a real conversation, one that would go beyond the surface level of the incident and delve into the emotional wreckage it had caused. "Noah," Alexander began softly, I know you've been going through a lot lately. I want to hear from you. How are you feeling? What's going on in your head?" Noah remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Alexander waited patiently, giving him the space he needed. Finally, Noah spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. "I don't know, Dad. I feel confused. I thought she was my friend. I thought she was there to help me. But now I don't know who to trust." Alexander felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a good father, on providing Noah with everything he could ever need. But here was his son, questioning everything he knew about trust, about the people around him. It was painful to witness. "It's okay to feel confused," Alexander said, his voice calm and reassuring. "When someone you trust betrays you, it can make everything feel uncertain. But you have to know, Noah, that not everyone is like Maria. Not everyone will hurt you." "But how do I know?" Noah asked, his eyes brimming with tears. "How do I know who to trust now?" Alexander reached out and pulled his son into a tight hug. "You can always trust me, Noah. I will always be here for you, no matter what. And together, we'll work through this. Trust takes time, but we'll rebuild it, okay?" Noah nodded against his father's chest, his small body trembling with emotion. Alexander held him close, his heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility he carried. This was no longer just about protecting his son from physical harm. It was about restoring the emotional security that had been shattered by the actions of someone they had both trusted. The days turned into weeks, and the healing process was slow but steady. Alexander sought therapy for Noah, hoping that a professional could help his son process the trauma he had experienced. They both attended family counseling sessions, where they worked through the emotions that had built up in the wake of Maria's betrayal. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt like he was doing the right thing. The therapy sessions were difficult, and Noah often resisted opening up. But with time, the boy began to talk more freely, and the anger and confusion that had once consumed him slowly began to subside. During this time, Alexander also took it upon himself to reevaluate the people he allowed into his life. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had neglected to truly understand the people around him. Maria had been a glaring example of how easily one could be deceived by appearances. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that had forced him to look inward. One evening, Alexander found himself at a crossroads. Noah had made considerable progress in his healing, but Alexander still felt the weight of guilt pressing on him. He couldn't erase the past, but he could make the future different. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the photograph of his family, the picture of a time when life had seemed so simple. He thought about his own father, a man who had taught him the importance of integrity and trust. Alexander had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their motivations. But Maria had shown him just how wrong he could be. But there was one thing Alexander knew for certain. His son was resilient. Noah had weathered the storm, and though the scars would remain, they would fade in time. Alexander vowed to protect him, to ensure that nothing and no one would ever come close to hurting him again. The turning point came on a weekend morning when Alexander and Noah decided to take a trip to the park. It had been weeks since Noah had truly smiled, but as they played catch in the open field, the first hints of joy began to return to his face. The sound of his laughter, though faint at first, was like music to Alexander's ears. It was a sign that his son was slowly returning to himself. Noah looked up at his father, his eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, look, I got it!" Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Great job, buddy. You're getting really good at this." The bond they shared, once strained and uncertain, was slowly rebuilding. Alexander knew that there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. His son was healing, and so was he. Together, they could move past the betrayal, stronger than before. Weeks later, Alexander sat down with Noah again, this time in the quiet of the living room. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm glow through the windows. He had something important to say. "Noah," Alexander began, his voice gentle, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've been so strong through all of this, and I know that it's been hard, but you've made it through. I'm so lucky to have you as my son." Noah looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Dad. I'm really glad you're here. I don't know what I would do without you." Alexander's heart ached with love for his son. He had almost lost him both physically and emotionally. But now, as he looked at Noah, he knew that the love they shared would always endure, no matter the hardships they faced. "I'll always be here for you, Noah, and I promise we're going to be okay. I'm not perfect, but I'll always try my best to make sure you're safe and happy." Noah nodded, his smile returning, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle in his heart. As the day stretched into weeks, the emotional weight that had once suffocated their household began to lift. Alexander had done everything in his power to help Noah heal, and Noah in turn had shown remarkable strength. The healing process wasn't quick, nor was it easy. But through their shared efforts, a new chapter had begun to unfold, a chapter marked by resilience, understanding, and most importantly, trust. Despite the lingering ache of betrayal, Alexander had come to realize that the love he had for his son was his greatest strength. His commitment to ensuring Noah's well-being, to guiding him through the aftermath of Maria's deceit, had been the anchor that kept them both grounded. Every day was an opportunity to rebuild not just Noah's sense of trust, but also their own relationship. Alexander had learned the hard way that trust was fragile, that the people you think you know can sometimes betray you in ways that shatter everything. But he had also learned that the road to recovery was paved with patience, understanding, and above all, love. It had been a difficult journey, but he had made a promise to himself that he would never let anything or anyone break the bond he shared with his son again. One afternoon, after school, Noah came home with a note in his hand. Alexander was in his study, reviewing some business documents, when Noah entered the room, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by a hesitant excitement. "Dad, I got something today," Noah said, his voice a mixture of nervousness and pride. Alexander put down his papers and turned his attention to his son. "What is it, buddy?" Noah handed him the note, and as Alexander read it, he felt his heart swell with pride. It was an invitation to Noah's school play-in event he had been looking forward to for weeks, though he hadn't shared much about it in recent days. "I'm going to be in the play, Dad," Noah exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement. "I got the lead role." Alexander looked up from the note, his eyes shining with pride. "That's amazing, Noah. I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard for this, and I know you're going to do great." Noah grinned, the joy in his eyes unmistakable. "Thanks, Dad. I really wanted you to come." Alexander reached out and pulled his son into a hug. For a moment, they just stood there, the warmth of the embrace a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. The laughter, the joy, the love, they were all there now, even after everything that had happened. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be there, front row, cheering you on." As they pulled apart, Noah looked up at his father, his expression softening. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking, maybe it's okay to trust people again. Not everyone is like Maria, right?" Alexander's heart swelled with emotion at his son's words. "That's right, Noah. Not everyone is like Maria. You'll meet people who are kind and trustworthy. It's okay to let them in. Just remember to trust your instincts and always come to me if you're ever unsure." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "I'll be careful, but I think I'm ready now." It was moments like these, when the depth of his son's growth became clear, that made everything Alexander had gone through worth it. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them closer together. They were healing, and Noah was beginning to rebuild the trust he had lost, not just in others, but in himself. As the weeks passed, Alexander found a renewed sense of peace. His relationship with Noah was stronger than it had ever been. The scars from the past were still there, but they no longer defined them. They had learned how to move forward, how to grow from their pain, and how to forgive not just others, but themselves as well. Alexander had also taken steps to ensure that his son's future would be free from the kind of manipulation that Maria had inflicted upon him. He became more involved in Noah's daily life, from helping with homework to attending every school event. His priorities had shifted. No longer consumed by the demands of his career, he now focused on being the kind of father Noah deserved. In the midst of all this, Alexander also realized that his personal life needed to be reshaped. He had isolated himself for far too long, too focused on his work to truly connect with others. But seeing Noah embrace life with such optimism had reminded him that there was more to living than just the pursuit of success. He had to find a balance that allowed him to love and be loved, to nurture his relationships, and to give his son the best chance at a happy, fulfilling life. The night of the school play arrived, and Alexander sat in the front row, eagerly waiting for the performance to begin. Noah had been nervous all day, but now, as the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, he stood tall on the stage, his voice strong and clear as he delivered his lines. Alexander watched with tears in his eyes as Noah stole the spotlight, his performance flawless. The applause that followed was deafening, and Alexander couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with pride. His son had overcome so much, and now he was standing in front of an audience, his confidence radiating from every pore. After the play, Alexander found Noah backstage, still beaming with excitement. "You were incredible," Alexander said, his voice filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you." Noah grinned, his face lighting up with happiness. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." Alexander pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the warmth of their connection. "I'm always here for you, buddy. Always." As they walked home together that night, Noah's hand tucked into his, Alexander felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but they had come so far. They had faced the darkest moments and emerged stronger. The future, while uncertain, was full of possibilities. And together, they would face whatever came next. In the months that followed, Alexander continued to make his family his priority. He continued to support Noah's growth and healing, and their bond became even stronger. Maria's shadow gradually faded from their lives, and with it, the pain she had caused. It had been a chapter they had closed, but the lessons learned from it would stay with them forever. Noah had regained his trust in people, but he had also learned the importance of protecting his heart. He understood that not everyone had his best interests at heart, but he was no longer afraid to let others in, to trust again. And Alexander? He had learned that the truest measure of success wasn't found in the wealth he had amassed, but in the love and trust he had nurtured with his son. He had learned that sometimes the greatest victory was simply choosing to love and protect those who mattered most. Together they were a family that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more united, and ready to face the future, whatever it might bring.